Welcome back to the session 26. Um, in the previous sessions, or last two sessions, I guess precisely, we talked about the naming system for the Chinese people and the naming system for the Chinese places, which of course went much beyond the naming system itself. It was pretty much the Daoism at work. Uh, and that I guess I gave the analogies, hopefully try to relate to the Taoism teaching. And then you might ask, so all this Taoism stuff is just about something so abstract on a very, very high level, nothing specific. Um, it really just never came down to earth. Well, I wouldn't say that. So, and here's my point, right? I don't know if you would agree. If you look at a particular civilization and want to decide for yourself how advanced this civilization ever, I guess, came up to, you would see a lot of time. I guess that's a criteria for I guess many folks, not just for myself. You look at their calendar. Why is that? Because if um, the people of certain culture were sophisticated enough to come up with their own calendar, that required at least two things. One is their knowledge in astronomy, right? And then the other is, of course, the mathematics. So if they actually already had a pretty advanced knowledge on the astronomy, then, based on that knowledge, and they know how to calculate, so they would have their own Chinese, their calendar. And the Chinese did have their Chinese calendar from very, very long time ago. Um, so when in the old days, very, very old days, the Chinese, when they talk about astronomy, it's not exactly in the same context as what we, know about astronomy today in the, I guess, modern and then contemporary Western school of science, in that sense, about astronomy. And also, when the old Chinese or ancient Chinese talk about the geography, that wasn't the same. In fact, very, very different from the modern and contemporary school, Western school of science in that sense, because most commonly the the ancient Chinese who had the knowledge of astronomy, and this is after the calendar was already set up, they use that to predict a lot of things happen. And of course, those who read the Chinese novels, the classical novels, were probably uh, acquainted with certain historical or fictional characters who actually knew, how to calculate, and they use this, description, like, basically using their finger to do the calculation. What were they calculating? They were actually predicting the pattern, the probability of the weather changes. So it's kind of like a weatherman, forecast. And if you were about to, conduct a major war game, your knowledge of that, weather change, and be able, with that capability, be able to forecast, obviously it would help you big time, right? You could use that, to your advantage. That was said about a lot of the Chinese, wise men, and they were not necessarily military generals. Actually, the military generals probably were trained to do the formations, the battles, to fight it, but not necessarily with the capacity to do this, because this was some very sophisticated knowledge, right? The astronomy and also the mathematic calculations. Uh, the, and that does not just stop there. The same knowledge actually was also used frequently in feng shui, the astronomy, because if you don't understand astronomy in the sense of the classical Chinese science, there's no way you could do it right, because you would have to be able to locate where the invisible dragon, surrounding for either the royal palace or the tomb side, you know, uh, for the living and for the dead, for the empress, you won't be able to do that. So you got to use that knowledge, right? So basically, that's whatever's the stars, uh, in, you know, in the sky, I guess in a way, and how does that reflect down on Earth? Where this future either home side or the the side for the dead, um, you know, how does that relate? You got to have that knowledge. And that was basically a lot of ancient Chinese, actually, they had to have this knowledge. As a matter of fact, I believe in the Chinese religious education system for Buddhists, they still had to take one course of what they call astronomy, which is different from what you normally would think, right? So that's astronomy. And then we talk about the geography. So for people who do feng shui, they have to know geography, but that geography is not what we typically, refer to. This geography deals with the five, I guess, fundamental elements of the yin yang system. So constantly strike for the balance between the five elements. That's the geography. So, for instance, like when I design my garden, right? I gotta have the metal, fire, water, earth, and wood. Okay, the five. These five elements they have to be presented in a very good balance, if not perfect balance. And then in the four directions, right? North, south, east, west. Which part of what elements should be presented more as versus less, and that is all different based on the particular time you were born, right? So in my I guess birth related I guess category or subcategory, that was for a in that little science called Earth Dog. Okay, so it sounds very confusing, and I'm not going to get into it. But for Earth Dog, how do you arrange, the five elements to your own best, I guess, luck, if you will. Obviously, you want to have a smooth balance of your lifetime. You don't want to have a lot of nasty surprises. So of course that's for that. So all that was supposed to be geography. So when the ancient Chinese say 天文 means astronomy, that's what it meant. And 地理, which is corresponding English word is geography. So when in ancient China, if it's a extremely well respected Chinese intellectual, this person ought to know about the Chinese sense of the astronomy and the Chinese sense of geography. So they say 上知天文, 下知地理, but that had nothing to do with the contemporary science of the astronomy or geography. It was totally a different context all by itself. So you see, I just gave you the example that the Taoism actually came into very practical knowledge in practice, right? So the same knowledge, obviously, it was applied first to the selection of a site for a construction, either for the tone or for resident for the livings. You gotta have that, at the very beginning. And in evidence, we see Beijing after 3,200 some years, follow the old days, it's still there. It's still there, right? As versus the other cities in China, a lot of them just basically came and went, and eventually totally became, anonymous. At one time they had their glories. So I'm not saying this is something. Oh, this is the evidence directly support. You gotta have this and that, but I think a lot of evidence out there. It's really up to you to decide, how much do you recognize and do you really want to follow in your own practice. Personally, I begin to do that because a couple of years ago, I still, doubted a lot of this, but after the study, at my age, my stage of my life, I begin to realize a lot of it actually makes sense, especially for someone who, has been out of geographically China for, I lost track, probably 30 some years. Or in other words, for, most of my life, I have been away from China, and now I study all this ancient Chinese stuff. It really does make more sense to me. So I guess the whole concept of the Taoism actually, I believe, although it was born about the same time as a theory, I guess as a philosophy, was probably before the Confucianism came into formation as a system, as a philosophy. Well, it's not a philosophy, but it's a system. The two coexisted side by side, but it was the Taoism actually made China, because you don't really find the evidence, at least in the contemporary Japan. Okay, that's not in Japan. And there's of course, personal. I think I can find the logical reason for that, because for the ancient Japanese started to import the Chinese system, they went first for the religion, which was the Buddhism. So it was a lot of Buddhist monks, who brought the Chinese system to Japan, right? So in the cultural exchange between the two countries, and Taoism was not part of Buddhism, right? We already discussed this in the first few sessions. So how do you imagine a Chinese or Japanese Buddhist monk actually import Taoism into Japan? That would be, not really working perfectly with their religion, and let alone, fit in seamlessly like in China. No. So that was the basic, or fundamental differences between the ancient China and ancient Japan. In the Chinese civilization, the fundamental, base, or the three cultural pillars, were Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. And you don't see the three in Japan. And then as far as the Buddhism goes, that again was brought to Japan by the Chinese Buddhist monks, that took a very interesting spin. And so the Buddhism in Japan is not exactly the same as the Buddhism in China. I don't even think personally that was even halfway there, because the Japanese Buddhism pretty much just was customized into the perfect fit for the needs by the shogunate in the who were ruling the ancient Japan, right? So all they wanted was the absolute loyalty and obey, obey, and obey. So that was the Buddhism in Japan, but not in China. So when you look at it on Vietnam and Korea, uh, I really don't know enough about the two countries to come up with the I guess my personal conclusion on whether or not the Daoism were in their countries. But one thing for sure, when we talk about so-called East Asia, I guess we're referring to China, Vietnam, Korea, Japan. The four countries had this cultural roots somehow related, at least to Buddhism was the blend, the Chinese blend of I guess uh, uh, Confucianism. But the only thing, the question there, remember, Japan never was part of the Chinese system. They just did on their own on a volunteer basis. But Korea and Vietnam was part of the same system. They did have exactly the same system working in their own country outside the Chinese border. But I'll give you a little example. This was probably about, somewhere around a decade ago. I don't remember exactly when. I visited a city on the coast, uh, on I guess the middle part of Vietnam on the coast. It was a coastal city, and I was there for a windmill project. Survey. I want to make sure, the route. It was a route survey. I want to make sure because I was working on to get the logistic job for that windmill project, and so my local host took me, on the route, and we did the run, but then basically I had about a whole week at time because that route survey didn't take long. I had a whole week. Basically, I spent my time there, on the beach, and that was a nice little villa. And back then, the cost was, you know, amazingly affordable. So I had my good time. But then, I had too much time to kill. So wherever I went, I always try to find if they have the local museum. So I guess I covered a few museums, and one of them was a history museum. So I visited. It was not very big, and then the exhibits I guess browsed. Uh, a lot of them were in classical Chinese. Those were the Vietnamese royal court official documents, and it was all in classical Chinese. And of course, I could read, easily. So I was actually telling the local guide about what those things were about, right? And he looked at me like, wow. Well, see, that's the thing. In Vietnam, by my observation, there are two kinds of temples, Buddhist temples. One that they do have the monks that are actually, I guess the nice way to say is interpreting the theories, and the other is they don't have that in the process or procedure to basically to explain to you in Vietnamese about the Buddhism. But either way, both kind of temples, before you walk in, you see this nice cupolas hanging outside the temples before you even get to the entry of the temple. You see everything in Chinese. Of course, the Vietnamese would not be able to read and understand, but I could. Um, so the problem there is, I think, I don't know, I don't remember the exact year, but I think it was 1870s when the French, moved in and made Vietnam a colony. The Vietnamese characters began to change, become alphabetic, right, in their own way. So ever since then, they lost their, I guess, capabilities to read, what the Buddhist, teaching, all put, imprint in Chinese, right? Uh, well, they just have to deal with it. They're fighting it, right? The same with uh, the Japanese. What helped the Japanese was the Japanese, at the beginning, they had the same, school of the Buddhism, like in Vietnam and, Korea. Not exactly the same, but the similar. But then eventually, Zen took the, I guess, the dominant influence. And for them, basically, you don't have to read Chinese. You don't have to be a Chinese illiterate. Remember, I mentioned the last greatest man in Zen, he was a Chinese illiterate himself. So the Japanese, they didn't have to deal with this problem anymore. They can't read Chinese, but they don't have to. But the type of specific, school of Buddhism went into Vietnam and in Korea and took roots there. That was not the type that, easily for the Chinese illiterate. And of course, in Korea, they came up with their own characters as well, also alphabetic. But you would notice that in Korea, in their local newspaper, every once in a while, you still see the Chinese character, came up. Not as much as in the Japanese newspaper. And I believe a lot of them, their family names still remain in the Chinese character. But not in Vietnam. You don't see any Chinese characters in their local newspaper anymore, right? So in Japan, when you see their road sign, a lot of it, they use the Chinese character. They don't use their own alphabetic characters. Why? The Chinese characters actually, with two Chinese characters, you can say a lot, and it takes a lot more Japanese alphabetic characters to fill up the, that the same function. You would take a lot more space. So basically, the disconnection from the ancient Chinese culture or civilization from all these three countries, they all came up with their own alphabetic characters. I believe start from there, because then the religion and a lot of things, of course, do they need Chinese? Of course they don't. But if they want to continue that civilization, and if you notice, the South Korea, their state color, the flag, actually that was, I would say that's a sign of yin yang. Okay, so that's Daoism. But is that, really in their life? I wouldn't know enough to say, one way or another. The Vietnamese, I think, compared, between all the other three, they call East Asian countries, I think the Vietnamese are probably the most chilled or relaxed East Asian people. That, in spirit, I would say it is Taoism at work, but I don't really find the evidence otherwise. But once again, I don't read Vietnamese, I don't speak Vietnamese, I don't even have Vietnamese friends. So I don't think I'm qualified to say, anything about this. I'm not, I don't have my, I guess, enough knowledge to give the comments on that. But all this basically is just trying to give you a little background on, where the so-called East Asian culture came from and where it is and why. And I will talk a little more about it in the next session. Until then, bye.